A man called Edward Lewis is on the phone with his girlfriend Jessica at a party. She tells him she's speaking more to his secretary than to himself, and that she's breaking up with him. While leaving, he meets a woman who's newlywed, asking her if she spoke more to his secretary than him when they were dating, and she replies his secretary was one of her bridesmaids. Outside, Edward asks his lawyer Philip to borrow his car. Philip gets worried his car will get damaged since Edward is a bad driver, but reluctantly agrees. That evening, a woman called Vivian is waking up and starts preparing to go out. As she is finished and is about to leave, she sees her landlord in the stairwell and decides to go back into the apartment. She goes to pick out money for rent, but only sees a little money left, and instead leaves through the window. She goes to a nearby bar, and goes up to her friend called Kit and asks if all the money's gone. Kit answers she used some for a party, and Vivian replies she can't believe she took their rent money while she was sleeping and bought stuff with it. Meanwhile, Edward arrives in the city, asking a poor man how to get to Beverly Hills, and the man replies he's already there. Kit and Vivian are talking on the street as a man driving by asks for a freebie since it's his birthday, and Kit tells him to dream on. Suddenly the two see a Lotus Esprit stopping, and Kit tells Vivian she should go for him and not take less than $100. She goes up to the window and asks if he wants a date, but he says he just wants directions to the Regent Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Vivian says she can help him for $10. First he thinks she's ridiculous, but agrees. He only has a $20 bill however, and Vivian insists to show him personally for that amount. As they begin to drive, she tells him he's forgot to turn on the lights on the car. Edward asks for her name, and she playfully teases him, asking what he wants it to be, but then tells him it's Vivian. She starts asking about the car and comments it must corner like it's on rails, but Edward doesn't know what that means, knowing nothing of cars. Suddenly he asks if she's ever driven a Lotus, which she hasn't, and Edward says she will do it right now. Vivian tells him to fasten his seatbelt, and shows him what the car really can do. He asks how much money them girls earn these days, and Vivian says they can't take less than $100. Edward thinks she meant $100 a night, but she clarifies it's an hour. Edward comments that it's stiff, but Vivian playfully interprets what he said differently and starts touching him, responding, "No, but it has potential." They arrive, and Vivian says she'll grab a cab back, and the two bid each other goodbye. Edward however walks back up to her, saying he'd be very pleased if she could accompany him into the hotel. She gladly follows him, and asks his name. He says Edward, and she jokes Edward is her favorite name in the whole world. They walk into the hotel, and Vivian gets his jacket since the hotel requires appropriate clothing. Edward orders some champagne and strawberries to the room. As they get to the elevator, Vivian behaves in a provocative manner, and a woman tells her husband to close his mouth. They get to the penthouse, and she continues acting flirtatious. She thinks the apartment is amazing, saying it has a fantastic view. Edward says he's scared of heights and never goes out there, but takes her word for it. Vivian asks what he will do with her now that she's there, and he responds he doesn't know since he didn't plan this. She says he can pay her in the meantime to maybe break the ice. Vivian then picks up several colors and asks him to pick which one he wants. Edward then says he just wants to talk a bit, and so they begin to talk. Suddenly, the doorbell rings, and Vivian runs to open it. The man has brought the champagne and strawberries, and Edward gives him a tip. Vivian asks if he has a wife or girlfriend, and Edward says he is both. She asks how that works, and Edward replies his ex-wife lives with his ex-dog in his ex-home, and his ex-girlfriend Jessica is moving out as they speak. Vivian sees he's not drinking and asks if he will, and Edward replies he doesn't drink. She comments she likes his seductive scene, but says she's on an hourly rate and asks if they can move it along. Edward senses her time problem is a major issue for her and asks how much for the whole night. Vivian says he can't afford it, but he insists. She says $300, and Edward says deal. Soon after, Vivian fixes something in the bathroom as Edward walks in on her. She hides something, and Edward says he doesn't want illegal stuff in there. While she explains she doesn't do illegal stuff, he notices it's dental floss, and she explains it's for the strawberry seeds. Later, Edward is working on the phone as Vivian watches TV. She asks him to join her picnic, but Edward declines. Vivian soon after notices Edward is watching her intently, and she begins undressing for him. She gets close to him, and asks what he wants, and Edward asks back what she does, and she replies she does everything, except kissing on the mouth, and Edward says he doesn't either. Next, Edward is taking a shower, and soon after goes back into the bedroom and sees Vivian with her real hair. It's early morning, and Edward is on the phone with Philip, and they note Mr. Morse is going to fight for his company. Edward then tells Philip his car corners like it's on rails, and Philip, not knowing what it means, gets worried, and Edward hangs up. Edward offers Vivian breakfast, having ordered everything on the menu. She asks what he does, and he explains he buys companies in financial difficulty. She says he must get them for a bargain price then, and Edward explains he's buying one company right now for the bargain price of $1 billion. While she helps him tie his tie, she asks what he does after buying the companies, and he says he breaks them up into pieces and sells the pieces for more than the whole. Not long after, Philip explains Mr. Morse's grandson will join him for dinner, and says he should probably get someone to join him too. Suddenly, Edward hears Vivian singing, and hangs up on Philip. He explains to Vivian that he has a business proposal, to hire her to stay with him for a week. She replies playfully that, if it's 24 hours a day, it's gonna cost him. Edward asks how much, and Vivian says $4,000. Edward negotiates, saying $2,000, and Vivian immediately counters with $3,000, and Edward says done. She gets totally ecstatic. Edward gives her some money and explains they will go out in the evenings, and wants her to buy something elegant to wear, not too sexy. As he has left, she screams of joy and happiness. She calls Kit and explains to her about Edward, and that she will get $3,000, as well as extra money for clothes, and Kit is super jealous. Vivian says she will leave some money for her in the reception and asks her to come by. Next, Vivian leaves a letter with money in the reception, and a hotel manager asks the receptionist if she's seen Vivian before. Vivian walks around among the expensive stores and feels on top of the world. She walks into a shop, but the retail workers tell her the clothes won't fit her and that they are too expensive for her. Vivian says she has money to spend, but then they tell her to get out of their store. She is dispirited and walks back to the hotel. As she gets back, the hotel manager stops her and asks her to follow him to his office, introducing himself as Mr. Thompson. He explains Edward is a very special customer and that they are willing to overlook who he brings as guests. He then asks who she is to Edward, and she answers she's his niece. Mr. Thompson then asks if he will ever see her at the hotel again after Edward leaves, since she surely can't have other uncles at the hotel. She answers he won't, and the two have an understanding. As he tells her to dress more conservatively, Vivian tells him somewhat saddened she tried to buy clothes, but no one would help her. He lifts the phone, and Vivian gets scared he will call the police, but then Thompson starts talking with a woman in a nearby boutique, asking for a favor, and says he's sending over a very special guest. Next up, Vivian meets a woman who's called Bridget, who's very sweet, and helps her. Meanwhile in an office, Edward and his partners make a plan to buy Morse's company, after which Edward leaves. Philip asks about the woman who sang on the phone, but Edward says it's nobody he knows. Suddenly, Vivian thanks Thompson in the lobby for helping him, saying he's cool. As she gets back to the room, the phone rings, and it's Edward, jokingly saying she should never pick up the phone. He tells her to meet him in the lobby later and they hang up. Edward calls back immediately and reminds her not to pick up the phone, and they laugh. Soon after, she asks Thompson for help. He helps her learn dining etiquette, but she's finding it a bit hard to remember what all the forks and knives are for. Later, Edward returns to the hotel, but doesn't see Vivian. Mr. Thompson appears, telling him he has a message from his niece, that she's waiting for him in the lounge. Edward says they both know she's not his niece, but thanks him. In the lounge, Edward first misses her, and is surprised how sophisticated she looks, saying she's stunning. They go to a fancy restaurant, and meet Mr. Morse and his grandson David, and Edward introduces Vivian. Later, Vivian struggles with what fork to use, and Mr. Morse tells her he himself has never been able to figure which goes with what. Later, Mr. Morse asks Edward what he intends to do with his company if he buys it, and Edward says he will break it up and sell it in pieces. David gets angry and respectfully wishes Vivian the best and leaves. Mr. Morse himself wishes Vivian the best too, and tells Edward he will tear him apart. Back at the hotel, Vivian thinks the business was good. Vivian comments she however think he likes Mr. Morse. Edward says it's irrelevant if he likes him, saying he tries to not get emotional in deals, and Vivian says she's the same, explaining that she's like a robot with a guy, she just does it, and which is why she doesn't kiss anyone. Edward says they are very similar, they both screw people for money. He says he will go downstairs for a while and leaves her. Late that night, Vivian calls room service and asks where Edward is, and is led to him. Edward plays piano for the hotel employees, and she's impressed when hearing him. He then asks them all to leave them, which they do, and the two start having an intimate moment together. Edward lifts her up on the piano, and they both start caressing each other. The following morning, Edward gives Vivian his credit card to buy clothes, and she says the stores weren't nice to her last time. Next, Edward follows her to the stores to make sure they are nice to her, and explains to the store owner they will spend an obscene amount of money in there. The store owner becomes euphoric and brings out several women who start helping Vivian. Suddenly, Edward gets a call from Philip, who says there is a problem, and Edward has to leave. Vivian continues testing clothes, and is treated like a true queen, buying a lot of clothes. While shopping, she walks into the store that was mean to her last time, saying they made a big mistake, and leaves. She gets back to the hotel, and Mr. Thompson gets happy seeing her. Vivian is really glowing. Meanwhile, Philip is happy because they found a way to buy Mr. Morse's company even though he doesn't want to sell it, but Edward doesn't listen. Philip asks what is wrong with him this week. Edward then tells Philip he loved to play with building blocks as young, remarking they don't build anything in the company, they only destroy. That evening, Vivian has prepared a surprise for Edward, only wearing a tie, and next up Vivian gives Edward a therapy bath. The following day, they go to a polo game, and Edward introduces her to two of his previous partners who have married other rich guys. They tell Vivian everyone is trying to land Edward, but Vivian replies she's not trying to land him, but is using him to sleep with him, and leaves them stunned. Later, people remark how sweet Vivian is, telling it to Edward. Edward and Vivian have fun together, and all the while Philip watches them. As Mr. Morse's grandson David, who is playing in the game, stumbles into Vivian later, Philip inquires about Vivian, thinking she's a spy Morse is set. Trying to stop Philip from worrying, Edward explains he picked her up on the street, and Philip starts laughing. While Edward goes to talk to a senator, Philip walks up to Vivian, telling her he knows what she is and asks if they can get together when Edward leaves. As they get back to the hotel, Vivian is upset and becomes angry he told people who she was without informing her first so she'd be prepared. Edward says he's sorry, but that Philip thought she was some industrial spy, and since Philip has been his attorney for 10 years, he thought he could trust him. She says no one has made her feel as cheap as he did today, and says she wants her money so she can get out of there. He picks up the money, but she ignores it and leaves anyway, which Edward sees. As she waits for the elevator, Edward comes out saying he's sorry and that he wasn't prepared to answer questions about them, that it was stupid of him, and adds he doesn't want her to leave. As the elevator arrives, Vivian doesn't go in, and then tells Edward he hurt her and that she shouldn't do it again, and the two go back inside. That night, Vivian tells him about her life and how she met Kit, who worked on the street, and made her do it as well, explaining her life is not what she once dreamed it would be. Edward comments she is a very bright and special woman who could be so much more. The next day, Edward is leaving early from work for a date, and Philip asks if it is with the street worker, and Edward tells him never to call her that again. At the hotel, Edward tells Vivian she looks good but that something is missing, and shows her a necklace he's borrowed. After having asked, she's shocked it's $250,000. In the lobby, all the hotel personnel note how beautiful she looks, and are happy for her. The two go to an airport to take a private jet to San Francisco. They go to a fine opera, and Vivian jokingly comments she sees a band on stage. Edward says people's first reaction to opera is dramatic, either they love for the rest of their life, or hate it. The overture starts, and Vivian is excited. During a performance, Vivian gets captivated and very emotionally involved in the play. Afterwards, she is absolutely filled with emotions and loves it. That night, Vivian asks Edward if he could skip work tomorrow to do things, and Edward remarks he does own the company. Next, Philip gets informed Edward is taking the day off, and is baffled. Vivian and Edward have fun together the whole day, doing spontaneous things. That night, Edward has fallen asleep on the bed, and Vivian slowly gets close to him and starts kissing him. He wakes up, and they both just continue, kissing each other passionately. The next morning, and the final day together, Edward tells her he's going back to New York, but wants to see her again, and so he has arranged so that she gets her own apartment, a nice car, money to shop with, and other things. But then Vivian gets upset, telling him a story of how her mother locked her in the attic when she was bad as young, and she had a dream how a knight on a white horse would climb up and save her from this trapped tower. She then adds the knight never told her in that dream he would put her in a great apartment. Philip calls, saying Mr. Morse wants to see him, and Edward says he's coming. Edward then tells Vivian he heard all she said, but that he isn't capable of more right now. Later, Kit comes by, and as they meet, Kit comments she was afraid to hug her since she might wrinkle her. Vivian tells Kit that Edward wants to see her again, but that she doesn't want to. Kit doesn't believe her and thinks she has fallen in love with him, and after some girly discussing, Vivian admits she's in love. Meanwhile, Edward meets with Mr. Morse, who says he's reconsidered his position, but is concerned about all his employees. Philip starts saying it will all be taken care of, but Edward stops him and asks everyone to get out so that he can get to talk to Mr. Morse alone. Once alone, Edward says his interest in his company has changed, saying he doesn't want to sell his company off in pieces anymore, but help him build it. Edward says they can leave the details for the others, and Mr. Morse is very happy and thanks him. As Philip gets in and Mr. Morse tells them all Edward and himself are going to build great ships together, Philip gets shocked. Edward takes a walk in the city, and a while later, Philip comes by Edward and Vivian's hotel room, asking for Edward, who's not there. She says Edward will be back soon, and as Philip sits down beside her, he starts touching her, grabbing her, and as she fights back, he hits her. Vivian screams at him to get off her, and suddenly, Edward appears. Philip starts calling Vivian a whore, and Edward hits him real hard, yelling at him to get out. As he has helped Vivian later, she tells him he made her a really good offer, but she wants more. Edward says the question is how much more, and Vivian replies she wants the fairy tale. Edward gives her the $3,000, thanks her, and says if she ever needs anything, a dental floss or whatever, he'll always answer her call. On her way out, Vivian thanks Mr. Thompson for everything, and he says he hopes to see her again, and gets a limousine for her. The following day, Vivian has packed her belongings to go to San Francisco to get a job and finish high school, telling Kit she used to get pretty good grades. Her bus leaves in 1 hour, and she gives Kit some of Edward's money, telling her to take care of herself. Edward is pondering as he's about to leave. In the lobby, Mr. Thompson gets a limousine for him. Edward asks if he can return the jewelry for him, and Thompson comments enigmatically it must be difficult to let go of something so beautiful, and then adds Daryl, the limousine chauffeur, also drove Miss Vivian home yesterday, and Edward thanks him. Kit is seen talking to someone as Edward appears buying flowers. Suddenly, Vivian hears a car horn, and outside, Edward arrives on a white limousine, yelling Vivian's name. Edward then begins climbing the stairs up to her, and while hugging her, he asks what happened after the night rescued her, and she replies she rescued him right back, and they start kissing. The end.